What's up, fellow podcaster? In today's podcast interview breakdown, I'll be reacting to an interview with Marilyn Manson for Apple Music. Here we go.
I want to hear you loud. I want to hear that beautiful voice of yours. Your beautiful New Zealand accent.
Oh, yeah.
Wait, too loud.
He asked if he could turn me up just so he could say too loud. It was all just so he could.
No, it wasn't.
It was laddering up to that one moment.
I'm literally this ear, right? This one? I don't know what side it's on for you. It's still clogged with fluid from shooting a video that I just did last weekend.
Two things that I see right here. One, the quality of this remote interview is on a different level. I know I nerd out on this stuff, and I'm just using a camera and a laptop here, but they must have some people there filming on a really good camera, and then they have a whole crew with lighting and good audio for the host doing this podcast interview. And you can tell it's remote because he's got the AirPods in, even though this is actually a huge common mistake that I see people do in their podcasts today, is do not use those Apple AirPods because 9 times out of 10, they're not charged. There's a Bluetooth issue. There could be a lag issue. Get the corded ones. There's a link in the description below. They're like $20, or just find an old pair of Apple iPhones that have the pin in it to plug into your laptop or computer. But the quality is awesome. And also the fact that these two know each other, you know it's going to be a good interview because Marilyn Manson is comfortable with this guy, so he's going to open up to him a lot more than somebody like me where he doesn't know and I have to break the ice or, just try and relate to him somehow so you can get the best sound bites possible. Those are the two things. Let's get back into it.
I told you I was going to do.
Which song was it?
I shot a video for Don't Chase the Dead with Norman Reedus from Walking Dead.
That is my second favorite song on the album.
Oh, thank you.
Right now.
What's your first?
Right now. Broken Needle.
I appreciate that.
What is the last?
When it comes to asking musicians about their favorite song on the album, I don't know why. It's a good question, but I guess and comment below, let me know. I've just asked it so many times to bands that I've interviewed before. I almost want to reframe it with something along the lines of like, which song are you most proud of and why? Or if you had to guess on your EP, which song was going to be a hit, what would it be and why? And is there a song, like I said, this goes back to the which one you're more proud of artistically. Is there a song that you wanted to make the EP that didn't, and why did that not happen?
Sentence on the album?
Now you're quizzing me. I'll never, ever play you again. So it's a bit of a play on words in that comparing a relationship to an LP, in a sense, and putting it away after it's scratched up and not wanting to hear that memory again. So I just started thinking about, or at least a year and a half before the pandemic happened, that it was about evaluating my own mental health and what I wanted to say, not knowing what would come, but the idea of sometimes there's things that have happened in the past. You have to forget about who you were, think about who you want to be. Not to sound like a motivational speaker, but just thinking about the past, were there sad points, were there strong points? What did you feel? No one's ever had an idyllic upbringing. If you had, you probably would. We wouldn't have this conversation right now. Yeah. We'd be boring. Because it's almost the sense of all of the kids in school, at least from my opinion, the ones that got picked on had to try harder to be creative. So the ones that had everything handed to them didn't try harder, and they end up being the bullies. And we're in a bully culture where it's like names and blames, and we just need to move past all that at this point. But a lot of that was going through my head.
I'm wondering, I'm trying to think of how to word this in the like most PC way I can. It's like, even though, and I don't condone bullying of any kind, I think kids nowadays are just mean, because when I was going to high school, and I'm sure he was, it was just, if something happened to you or they were going to pick on you, it happened at school. Now it's the internet, so everybody sees, so it's 10 times worse. And once again, kids are just mean. But as much as it sucked to get bullied like he did, I feel like, I don't know how I would ask it, but something along the lines of, do you think long term that gave you an edge because it forced you to be more creative? Does that make sense? And if it does, and you have a better way of wording it, definitely comment below.
I wrote that song, and on the LP itself, sorry if this is a spoiler alert, a lot of people have received the LP already. It just stays, it gets stuck on that last song until you take the needle off. So it continuously plays in perpetuity until you remove it.
So,
unless he already mentioned it, I'd want to know why he chose to do that for this record.
that leads me to my next question, which is, how does Shooter Jennings, who is the only son of Waylon Jennings, an original modern country music outlaw, and the Antichrist superstar, who for the longest time seems to have reveled in the chaos upon which you talk on this album, make an album that is easily the deepest, most personal, reflective album you've ever made in your entire career, and one that seems to me is searching for a pathway through to inspire rather than to light the flame to set the chaos into motion?
Great question.
That's what I get from it.
Thank you. Sometimes you need the fire to burn things down, metaphorically, to build them back up. So there's that element. But I don't think that we really were considering that so much, is that we wanted to make something that was, while we were listening to Diamond Dogs and other records that were, and Shooter was inspired by Antichrist Superstar, and I did not know that. And I was inspired by Black Ribbons, his album, not knowing each other still. When we got together, it just sort of amounted into this. It can't be only the lyrics. It has to do a lot with the melodies in which he evokes, and sometimes conjured me to come up with lines or melodies. And then sometimes, they would feed off one another, but we didn't expect it to be quite of the moment that it is right now. But I think I wanted to make a record that was always of the moment, where it's,
Yeah.
Can you ever think of an idyllic time that's ever really happened in life? There's never really been a true perfect era for anyone. So this is a bad time for everyone, but it's not any worse than what I grew up hearing my father talk about with the Vietnam War. And that's just my own personal experience. Everyone has had their own rough and their own way of interpreting the world, where none of it's going to ever be perfect. But I think if one way you could look at it, if all artists decide to stop making art, the entire world will fall apart.
It remains one of the only pure filters right now, especially, and I've spoken to this end with a few people about the voice of the artist and the fact that if you choose to put a record out right now, and even back in the day, there may have been an influencing factor from a label saying, this is too much, we can't. There are people who are paying out wages who don't want this. You've been on the receiving end of those conversations. I know you have. But you can do it yourself now. You're in a position whereby you can find the purest filter in order to express yourself. And more than ever before, we need that.
Well, not just...
And kind of, I can't, I'm trying to think of which podcast interview breakdown I had done. When it comes to musical artists, especially somebody who is as controversial as Marilyn Manson, it's like, if you're under the thumb of the label, and you want to be expressing your creativity and something's a hit. It was the Ronnie Radke one. I'll put that in the link in the description as well. But it's like, okay, you have this song in your head, you put it on paper, you record it, and you love it. but then you've got some A&R guy or some CEO of some record company being like, well, this is a little too much, Marilyn. I don't know if we're going to do that. So does that still happen to you at this level? And when you were coming up, how did you get around that? How do you express your creativity when a record label is just going to just destroy it and cut it to bits until it's unrecognizable? And does this still happen to you? Does it still happen to other artists? Is there a industry name for it? And you can kind of go down that rabbit hole. I don't like to talk about like censorship and stuff like that, but is he dealing with any kind of censorship, cancel culture? Like when you're writing, do you have to be careful? Like, are you just treading the line just out of sheer curiosity?
This musical artists, when you think about it, architects, painters, clothing designers, what you do, everybody who does something that adds to the world is the opposite of most politics and religion, which was my initial, I guess, hard-on or anger against the world, because I was unsatisfied with seeing politicians who are older people that's not about because they're older, it's just people that are not of the culture they're representing.
There's an institutionalization that comes from that thinking over time. And I suppose two questions spring to mind. I'll start with the first one. Do you feel proven right then if you arrived with something to say based on those two touch points, politics and religion, that's who I'm up against right now, and then take a look at where we are in society and what is occupying a lot of the debate and causing a lot of the disruption? Do you feel to some degree like you're on the right path and you've been proven correct?
So I've been seeing this more and more, and I've got to coin a phrase for it. It's like it's a double question, and this guy knows what he's doing, very professional. I just see this, and I've been trying to not do this as well. Those are two great questions. I would just reel it in, or whether you need a notebook or not, ask those individual. I know they piggyback off each other, but since they're two complex questions that are set up for him to have great sound bites, it's going to get diluted because he's going to try and answer two, and then he's only really going to answer one, and then he's just going to ask a follow-up question after that. So if you have a podcast and you do a lot of these podcast interviews, try to avoid these two-part questions. Even though when I asked a question just earlier, when I'm like, well, what is the song you're most proud of and why? I need to just phrase it as if I were asking them in person, I would just be like, what song are you most proud of? They would answer and then be like, well, why is that? Or why do you feel that way? So just beware if you're doing a lot of podcast interviews to avoid that two question hiccup.
Well, I feel that sticking to art is being on the right path, because all we have right now, we have art, music, movies, and books and paintings and whatever it is that inspires you. But without that, all we have is just propaganda and bullshit. And it doesn't really matter who's right or who's wrong. It's not even worth having a conversation about. But the conversation should be about everyone should figure out who they want to be, not who they were. And forget about your childhood scars, mentally, physically, whatever they are, and rise above, because now is the time for people to come together, and not in a hippie way as much as in a united way with art. Because if you didn't have art, you wouldn't have anything. We wouldn't have this camera that's filming us. We wouldn't have the couch you're sitting on.
But
I love this because this is part of my deeper purpose. Like, obviously, if this is the first time you're watching one of these, I was in broadcasting for 10 years. The last 5 were spent on the red carpet interviewing celebrities, rock stars, influencers. And that was great and all, but now that I'm doing my own thing, part of my deeper purpose is to bridge that gap, whether it's right and left. I feel like we are just arguing with each other. We're not coming together and having conversations. And it's just, we need to kind of put the swords away and realize who's kind of starting it. And it's the people up top. So just be very, very wary about that sort of thing. But I love that he wants to get the conversation started as well and kind of bring everybody back to reality.
Longest time, I think if you asked anybody about Marilyn Manson, even people who weren't necessarily big fans of yours, but aware of your presence because you have a strong presence, then you'd ask, is Marilyn Manson the kind of person who's trying to build people up and build up a strong foundation upon which to better understand each other? Or is he trying to tear it down? You know what the answer would have been. Now, would they have been right back then, or has everyone got you wrong the whole time?
If they would have been right back then, we wouldn't be here now, probably. Essentially, because I was saying, I could just say the same thing now. If you went back and rewind and listened to Antichrist Superstar, it could translate in some ways. There's things that were said in 1984 that could translate to right now, because the world doesn't always change. It is a time, is a flat circle. And things come back to themselves, but mostly I had joy making this record, which sounds very unlike what you'd expect for me to say. And I don't know if joy is the correct word.
I always thought you had joy in making your music.
I enjoy taking the piss out of people too, you know? I enjoy fucking shit. I enjoy being against the grain, you know? And I'm not trying to be some sort of hero or someone who's trying to help others. I'm just trying to relate in the same way I did from the beginning to other people like me, or anyone who...
For somebody who likes to be against the grain, I'm kind of like that too. So it's like when you know this could ruffle feathers, or whether it's a song or something that you say, or everybody's going right, you go left, and you're going against the grain, what is the internal feeling like to you when that sort of thing happens? And can we just nerd out on, like, I'm sorry, I'm a gear nerd. They've got at least 2 or 3 cameras. I'm guessing they're Reds or 4K cameras because they're doing zoom ins. Plus they've got that, they need professional audio, plus his earpieces, plus he needs to be able to see, say, and then double that with the other guy who's asking the questions, perfect lighting. I mean, to make something so simple, I mean, this looks so simple, but I already know there's probably like 3 guys there with Marilyn. There's probably 3 guys there with the host. And just when you bring this all in to Premiere or whatever they're editing with, I guarantee there's at least 10 layers. And it's just, I nerd out so hard on the quality of things, especially when this is a remote interview as opposed to in person. But yeah, as if you're a gear nerd like I am, please let me know in the comments section.
Anyone who's not I'm not trying to be a pop artist that writes songs to uplift people for their own benefit, which is usually self-serving. And not naming any names or anything like that, but just to out history, like We Are the World and things like that. Whatever, if those things accomplish something, that's not even an example. But just, I'm trying to make songs that people that I think are like me could potentially benefit from just by listening to.
You talked about getting to a place where you can look to your future and you can build yourself the person you want to be and not be tied to who you were and what you've done in the past. When people come to that realization, normally what follows is that there's a need to do the work, right? And established ways people do that are like therapy, or they get clean, they go to rehab, they do whatever they need to do in order to try to clear a roadmap for them to make a future and not be stuck as a broken needle on the record. How did you get to that place where you could make this album? Because there's a lot, I'm sure, that's tucked away. Was this a follow-on from your last album and from the process of losing a parent and losing your father?
I think mortality obviously sets in when you lose both your parents, within a short period of time, which everyone has to go through. It sucks, and I'm for everyone who's going to experience that, which eventually everyone has to, unless some sort of science fiction process happens. It makes you question who your family is. It makes you make sometimes foolish decisions about trusting people because your heart's wide open. When making this record with Shooter, because we both lost our fathers and we bonded over that in a sense. And his father was musical outlaw, as you said. My father was, also in his own right, real asshole, but outlaw, I mean, he did not play by the rules, but he raised me to be who I am. And I'm not ashamed of that. It just sometimes you miss your lost ones, but I try to put that into the music, and I tried to make this record also a story that's not just about me. It's about, ideally, if I could have made a book of it, it would just be mirrors for pages, literally, so that you could just see your own story in it. And, starting out with the intro, I think it was meant to set a tone. That was prose that I wrote on the moment. I had it in my head, but it was on the moment. I wanted it to introduce the record so that it would sort of, in any great movie or TV show or book or play or...
Well, I was going to...
Great question. Once again, I nerd out on interview stuff. This guy is doing a great job. He asked a really tough question about his dad and losing both his parents recently. The fact that they know each other and the way he asked it and was just so comfortable with it. This is what I was talking about in the very beginning, where somebody like me, I'd have to really choose my words carefully or guide the interview in a way where he would bring it up. But that was great. And also, if you've been watching these enough times, I am obsessed with the creative process. Marilyn Manson is super creative, so I would ask a ton of questions on that. I'd be, where does your creative process start? Where does it come from? Have you ever known it? Do you zone in on it? Does it require meditation? Do you get all your ideas in the shower, walk? Just for him saying, I know, to me anyway, where he's like, I'd love to have a book of mirrors. And it's just like you're looking at yourself, like going through your journey, whether he was being literal or metaphorical. I still think like that's pretty creative, and I'm sure there's a way to do it. Obviously, it wouldn't be glass, or maybe it is. I don't know. It's just, but it's like that creative stuff. And it's like, how do you know what's like art to you or creative to you that's maybe people aren't going to like, and then that there's stuff that people are going to like? It's like, how do you differentiate between the two? And those would just lead into a whole different directions. I wouldn't obviously rapid fire these, but when it comes to the creative process, I am just obsessed with this.
So that they would always be, and they'd grow into something. So it's that cycle of life.
Is there a spiritual reason for that as well as returning to the earth? Has it awakened a different side of your spirituality?
Great question again.
Spiritual only in that I believe that there's far more evil in the world than what people consider me to be, which is not a very obvious statement. Anyone could make that observation, but, I've been blamed for so many wrongdoings that had nothing to do with me. But as far as sin and accountability and things like that, which I grew up in Christian school, so the natural order would be for my brain to rebel against it. And instead, I think that I didn't embrace it. This is not a return for me. Like, I didn't somehow find religion or sobriety or something like that. I found a focus. And it was a focus on realizing my importance as a human being in the world. You have an importance for you, doing this that you do, and it's your passion. This is mine, and everyone has it. It doesn't have to be the same as ours, but everyone has it. Once you find that, it kind of shuts out all of the darkness around you.
And how did it feel when you lost that? How did it feel when you felt like what you were doing and making records and touring is...
See, I already know he's gearing up to ask about 2 or 3 questions in a row. So once again, just try to avoid that, especially if you're a new podcaster or interviewing is new to you. Just be a little wary of it. Once again, I'm not perfect either. I've just, over the course of my career, done about 5,000 interviews, and I just noticed about this like 2-step, it's like maybe even like a squirrel question, because you're only going to get a diluted amount of the one. But it's interesting to hear him talk about everybody's passion. Like if you, especially my last video, my last podcast interview breakdown with Mr. Beast, holy smokes, I have never in my life gotten so many trolls of people being like, oh, good idea, bro. Like reacting to podcasts. Why don't you get your own podcast? Actually, I do have my own podcast. It's called The Power of Video, and I'll link that in the description below. I interview creatives and professionals who are using video to grow their business, but I can't get these people on my podcast yet. So I've got to do this. I can't sit around and complain about it. You get more details if you go over to my TikTok at Thomas Jordan TV, but everybody has their passion. I was never blessed with a God-given talent. I can't sing. I can't dance. I can't play any instruments. I'm not a bodybuilder. I'm not a model, like anything that's scooped into the entertainment industry. But I will say I can ask a million questions. I'm literally batch recording these. So I'm going to be doing at least 4 to 6 hours of just recording this for you. Also to prove that these trolls are full of crap. Like the views are there. I'm still a smaller creator at this time, but this is what I love to do. YouTube. I'm trying to provide as much value as humanly possible. Give you all my years of interview questions, interview tips, because I don't want to be like the first tip to best podcast interviews is to not do the 2-step question or the 2 whatever. Like this is the way I want to do it, and I will go from there because I do the long form here, chop, put it on TikTok, and then maybe even go back when I do a tutorial, just like go back and be like, this is what I said for this episode, or here are 5 podcast interview tips, and I'll just cut these clips. But I'm telling you, the people that are like, this idea sucks, it definitely doesn't, because I'm the only one who reacts to other podcast interviews. I just went on a whole like diatribe there. Hopefully, I don't even know how many people get to this point, but thank you for watching. And if you got to this point and you still think this idea sucks, I'm going to keep doing them just for you.
But when it comes to, especially now, this is different because now we're talking this way as opposed to how we have talked when we met, 20 years ago. It's a different culture and a different scenario that we're stuck with. So we deal with it. And that's the way that real strong people deal with things. They face the problem and they either conquer it or they suffer from it. And not everybody's strong enough. So I try to, channel my own strength to make myself capable of dealing with it, because it's never easy to be in a position where you don't have any control. That's the worst possible thing. Like if you have an ill parent and you can't do anything about it, you feel helpless. If you're stuck in your house and your work you can't do, you're helpless. For us, fortunately, and for me, making this record, luckily, somehow it was finished, for the most part, far before any of the pandemic hit. It was in January when we really finished it. And it was never really written about this, but it seems as if it became the moment where it was supposed to happen. And, it's sad that Ozzy had to cancel his tour because he was ill. But I'd planned on spending my whole year kind of based around the concept of touring with Ozzy and releasing the record. And then everything suddenly shifted. And sometimes I don't like to use the word works out for a reason, things happen for a reason. I think things are fated and they come together.
I love it start to finish. And I think it's one of the best albums you've ever made, which is,
Thank you.
You know, you made a lot of albums. And I do think this is start to finish some of the best words you've committed to music, and you and Shooter have found some kind of incredible chemistry where there's vulnerability and weight behind it at the same time. I want to talk more about it. I got to go back a minute and because we never spoke about it and talk about the last time you tried to go out on tour around an album and you found yourself on the receiving end of what turned out to be a pretty serious accident on stage, you know, and the prop came over and I watched it because I've heard it happen.
That was horrible.
Well, a friend of mine, a mutual friend of ours, texted me and was like, you should check in on Manson. And I'm like, what happened? And he was like, he had a terrible accident on stage. So I went straight online to the news and they had footage of it. And I sent you a text straight away. And of course, you know, you got back to me when you were conscious. Can you just talk us through that experience? Because those kind of situations are just horrific to witness. And I can't imagine how it felt at the time.
So I think that I was very lucky that it was about 6 inches from my skull. When it fell, it was not secured, and I grabbed onto this giant lighting rig, essentially, that had these 2 guns on it. So, I mean, if there's an argument for gun control, I'll be right there in regards to those guns. Okay. Fair enough. So I have 10 titanium pins on my leg. Right here, 10. Just goes from here to here. And they're still there. They're going to be there forever. But I had to do a year and a half of rehab while on tour. I did a tour with it. And Dave Grohl and Axl Rose graciously offered their chairs. And I said, no. And I found this electric wheelchair that rose up. And I tried to make it into part of the show. And it was not a fun time at all. But it doesn't bother me now. It's actually more of a bionic leg, and it doesn't go off at airports either.
Oh, I was going to ask it. I kick myself every time I do this. This goes back to being confident in what you do. This happens to me more often than I'd like to, and I kick myself every time. As soon as he said that he had all those pins in his leg, I almost paused to ask if it goes off in airports.
Yeah.
Which is strange. Yeah. If anyone's heavy metal, it's my leg. It's full heavy metal.
One of the things I think that I'm really happy to acknowledge is that you came out of that time and you seem really clear-headed and you seem really focused on your craft and very present. And as someone who's struggled in the past with addiction, we've seen over and over again when people get into that situation and they're faced with the opportunity of painkillers or pain. And I wonder kind of how you dealt with that, because as someone who
I didn't take them.
You didn't take them?
I mean, I did initially I was in the hospital during the operation, but being that I had taken them in the past, which increased it to recreational use, I didn't want to fall prey to that. So I just didn't do it. So, I mean, it hurts, but, you know, but once your pain receptors in your brain, it changes the way you think. All your cortisol, all the dopamine, everything in your brain, it changes. So it does give you a different perspective.
So how did you get through that? Because you take these meds that are highly addictive to numb the pain, and then you get out, you know, to be self-aware enough to not take them. And then you did you have a sponsor? Do you have somebody who calls, or are you just like, I know if I take these outside of the hospital, that is just going to go down a very, very dark path?
I'm by no means a model of sobriety. He says,
but it changed you. But how did the accident change you?
Cheers.
Cheers.
It wasn't a struggle like for me where I don't get triggered like, oh, I want to do painkillers or something like that again.
Right.
It's just, it clouds your brain. It clouds a part of your brain. Well, I stopped drinking absinthe as well. It clouds the frontal lobe. You know, a lot of people find it to be artistically enhancing, but it also just, it bends your brain a bit. And sometimes in a bad way, where you are convinced that what you're doing is really great when it's just the drug telling you that. That's what I realized a while back, especially going into this record. But before that,
I want to talk to you about your relationship with your brain. Because you talk about the receptors and you know, I'm a believer that you can obviously train your brain. You can mold yourself into moving past pain, moving past things with help. And your brain and the way that you're made up has given us incredible art and has given you a life like no other. And yet I wonder what your relationship is like with yourself. Aside from being Manson, the performer, the artist, and everything else, especially at this point, making an album like this, which, as you say, is striving for enough reflection to get to the next point in life, the next point of growth. So this is an album based on growth. So,
okay,
who are you? You know, to yourself. Like, what is your relationship like? Because there are times I wish I could switch that thing off completely.
You mean the brain Ferris wheel that just keeps spinning in your brain? Yeah, that's a tough one. If you're a thinker of any sort, which everyone is, but if you're someone who finds it really difficult to be alone, you'll look for someone to be with you because you feel empty and you need like something to fulfill that. And that's been the past me. Or you might look for, drugs or alcohol. You might look for art, which is the best way to look, but not the easiest, because I'll admit that I'm very lazy when it comes to actually getting to doing it. Not lazy, but just sometimes I just need a nudge. And Shooter was so enthusiastic that he would say, hey, let's do this tonight. Hey, let's do this. Are you around? It's like 11 p.m. So I would go to his house, his studio, and we would record. And he found that he thought that 3 a.m. was the best gravel sound for my voice. And also when my brain was firing. And I think it's because, in my opinion, only that, or maybe not only, but the rest of the world sort of shuts down at nighttime. So there's less static. And I feel like that there's an overwhelming amount of static for me. It's not like I hear voices, but there's like this, first of all, there's no phones ringing. You know, everything has sort of calmed down so you could just focus on one thing. And when we're focused and we're working, the desire for other dark thoughts or dark passageways that you would normally resort to became channeled into making this record. So the idea of self-medicating, or the idea of, like being confused about who you are, all went away once I'm just with Shooter, our relationship working musically. Because he has a strangely positive energy, almost like in an innocent way, a childlike way, like the Big Lebowski, the dude, in a way. That's not saying about his talent. I just mean his personality. It would just I've never seen him in a bad mood once in my life. I bet people could probably say I've never seen Manson in a good mood once in my life. Except you right now. This is exactly the opposite.
Before they start going into something else, like, he is so right. And I don't know if it's with creatives, but this, for me, when he was talking about how the static is so loud during the day and then it just at night just silences and you work better through the night. When I was growing up in high school, it was like that. Like, I would be the biggest procrastinator ever, and I would have 4 months to do a project, and I wouldn't start till 11 o'clock when everyone was asleep, and just work through the night till 2, 3, 4 in the morning and knock it out before just do it, just because that's when my brain would, the static, as he says, would silence. So also being obsessed with the creative process. What is it like to be in studio with you at 3, 4 in the morning? Because I would pay if I had the money just to be a fly on the wall when creatives like this are just in their zone, and just keep my mouth shut and just sit there with like a notepad and be like, question, just let them do their thing and just ask later, because I don't know. I just think that would be so cool just to see how he would work, or just anybody really. But if you are a night owl and that's where the static goes away, let me know if that's you.
Well, this album will forever be recognized by you and by all of us as being that moment where you and Shooter came together, cleared away the static, and were able to find purity of thought. And it's clear on this album. But when you look back on some of those other albums, and I don't know if you do, maybe you don't, maybe you reserve that for fans only, but I do. I listen to your music
Sometimes.
all the time. And I wonder, when you go back and listen to those records, without a sense of self-judgment, but whether or not you recognize that the person in pain, or the person who's in love, or the person who's heartbroken, and what that feels like as an artist, going back and listening to your previous albums over the course of your life and earmarking them, recognizing the person who made them and how that makes you feel. Because if you allow yourself to reflect on that, that can be a journey back into the previous you.
Well, Shooter did do something really important, that when we were making the album, he was talking a lot about older records, and I was thinking about something different, but it was when we decided to make it, a 10-song record that has a clear A and B side. I painted the album cover and I showed it to him, and then the next day we wrote Infinite Darkness, which is first song on side B, the 6th song. And I'd never considered using a painting like that for an album cover. And it was also the first time I used black in the background of my paintings. I usually use white, negative space. And that's when I knew where we were headed, that it was a record, like the records that we liked growing up listening to. Shooter and I, probably also like what we talked about, you and I liked. And He had a great way of producing, in that he just found a way to get me focused completely only on singing and the words, and the other distractions are just gone. But it was not in a conventional sense, or like some sort of sorcery or something like that. I mean, there was in our own way, but it was, it made, when we got to that song in the record, that we knew we had to finish it. And we did Broken Needle, like I had mentioned before. Tom Wally was the guy who had the smarts to
Devilishly good-looking elder gentleman, was responsible for many great careers.
Mechanical Animals in Times Square. Beautiful man, looks like Pierce Brosnan. He looks like he's going to a yacht or coming from a yacht, always. It's a beautiful man.
So true. Beautiful man. Beautiful
it's
man.
So true. Initially, he was not certain about, this combination between me working with Shooter, because of whatever preconceptions he had regarding Shooter and country influence. I think that Shooter's influence in the bass lines and the way that we developed this really great syncopation rhythm where the vocals would work around the acoustic guitar, which almost was used as a percussion instrument. And Shooter and I would trust him in a way that I didn't have to double check what he was doing. And I did play a lot of the tambourine and sleigh bells and things like that, only because of my childhood knowledge of percussion.
I don't know. Him playing the triangle, I don't know why I just saw it, and he just said sleigh bells, and the first thing I thought of was Mariah Carey's Christmas album. But would you ever do a Christmas album? And if you did, what would it sound like? Have you ever thought about it, or is that just some tomfoolery? Like, nah, I'm not going to do that. And just a real quick to go back to also the studio question. He said his voice sounded the best around 3 a.m. or that's what his friend said. How long did it take to figure out that was the best time to record? Like, did you start at midnight, 1, 2, and then 3, and then 3 was perfect, 4 was too much? Like, how did you guys do that? And do you only record now at 3 a.m.? I don't know. I mean, there's so many, and then that would trickle down, and that's just a bunch of rabbit holes. But that's the point of doing these types of interviews. And I hate that I'm just now mentioning it, but I got my first podcast interview breakdown request. That's who I'm doing it for. And I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, man, because I'm telling you, when I worked in news, this was like my Achilles heels. So you'll have to let me know. But Scott Rencola is the one who told me that he'd like to see a podcast interview breakdown with Manson. It's my first request. I am super stoked. This is super interesting. I mean, there's a lot going on here. Him being super creative and just the production of this. I can't help but nerd out on it. So Scott, thank you so much.
But
it's a little known fact, by the way, anybody who's watching this, that Manson famously was brought into a high school band to play the triangle. That's correct, right? Yeah. Ding.
I don't know, whatever. Main point is
perfect.
So Shooter. There's a little skepticism initially, or not certainty on what the record would sound like. But we recorded I would say near entirety of it without playing it to the label, and even my manager or Shooter's manager. So we did what we wanted to do without the influence of the people who sell the music later. No offense to them, like that they're a valuable part of the machine that makes music powerful, especially Tom Moy, because he's always believed in everything that we've done. If it failed, we could take the blame ourselves and we could point a finger at anyone else. And that's why we picked like Spike Stent, for example, to mix it, because we thought that he could really add something to it. And he did, but we worked with him in the studio. Initially, when we went in, the main point was, if we have this record, we believe in it, can you make it sound better? And he did, and that's what I liked. But for the most,
I wish we could see, and this is once again back to the creative process, because he, from my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, he just said, okay, we're done with it. This is awesome. Make it better. How do you know that guy? And what is his role? And it's just like, does he listen to the whole thing? What's his process like? Does he's like, hey, if the album is an hour long, let me go through every single song and sit here and create tabs for you? It's like, oh, you can do this, you can do that. Do they have to be musically trained? Is it an engineer thing? Is it an audio thing? Man, there's so many questions there. And I'd want to know his view of failure. Is failure good to him? Like, do you look at his failures as failing forward and not having, and not being sucked down by failure? Because I feel like that's what a lot of people do, is like they failed and then they just tap out and then that's over. But it's like the best learning lessons. And if he does think that, did you always think that? Or how long did it take you to get into that mindset?
Most part, the record sounds like what we wanted it to sound like in the beginning, but Spike added a greater depth to it.
I mean, there's areas that you've never gone before, I think, in terms of the way the record sounds. I've definitely not heard songs, like We Are Chaos before. I want to talk about Solve Coagula, which is a very to me, that's one of the most important moments on the record. Where the line finishes, I'm broken. I'm just broken. But the first line of that,
I'm not
line,
special, I'm just broken.
I'm not special, I'm just broken.
But see,
now,
salve coagula is Latin. It means to break apart and put back together.
right.
So, and I got this tattoo a long time ago, and I'm glad that you liked that and pointed that song on the record out, because it's a point on the album where it's sort of coming to a conclusion. And I just remember making that, and Shooter, me trying to get out of him as a co-producer on the record, his most Southern moment, but without trying too hard to do something that isn't him. But so it's very, to me, it doesn't sound Southern.
Not at all. It sounds like something that it's almost influenced by Wayne Hussey. It almost has like a very kind of late 80s, early 90s gothic rock feel to it, to me.
If that's a compliment, I'll take it.
That line, I'm not special, I'm just broken, is, if you'd said that in any of your first 2 or 3 albums, it would have been a chant that 40,000 people would have screamed back at you, because it would have been more dressed up like, I'm not special, I'm just broken. And it would be like, ah! But you've stripped all that away, and you've presented that line in a way that, it's the way you present that line, which really, really struck me differently this time.
I appreciate the comparison. I said it in real life and thought, wow, that should be a song.
What was the context, if you don't mind me asking? I mean, I'm curious about the human spirit.
I'm not sure about the exact context, but someone was just, I don't remember who it was. It wasn't a loved one. It was just in the context of a dispute over something, not with Shooter. Someone was telling me that I was special for what I do, and it wasn't someone I knew. And that was my response. I just said offhandedly. And Shooter happened to be there next to me, because I think we were at a bar, or it might have been my birthday. I'm not really sure. It was just a fluid moment of not quite sure what happened, but someone said, man, you don't realize how special you are. And I just said, I'm not special, I'm just broken. And then Shooter pointed out to me, that should be a song. See, that's his genius, producer.
His genius.
I just want to compliment this host. Like, if you ever watch these, or if this is your first time watching this, I have ADHD and I'm dyslexic, self-diagnosed. So when I'm thinking, I'm looking around and I move my hands a lot. I am so jealous of people like this. And the other host, I did this for the Ronnie Radke podcast interview breakdown. But these people just have such a clear way of thinking, and just almost like a word symphony on how they word and phrase things. Like, I have to be a little bit more direct, because if I try and write a question, I'm going to stumble all over it. But this guy knows what he's doing. This is not his first rodeo. He's doing a great job.
Not say I didn't love myself, but I would say that I was not as happy with myself as I could be. So it's aggravating if you're at an airport or these are terms that don't apply to right now, but in the past. I don't think that I ever didn't love myself, but I don't think that I believed in myself at some points as much as I should have. And that's what I think that a lot of people need to hear from me. If they like what I do, or they believe in me, that I've always said this. Don't be me, be yourself. But more so, believe in yourself. There's no point in life where you can try to be perfect, because perfect is defined usually by other people. If you just find yourself as perfect, then you're just arrogant and narcissistic. So, I know that you're perfect, I'm perfect, but that's your opinion and my opinion. That's a compliment.
I'll take it, but I'm pretty fucking far from perfect.
Well, we all are. No one's perfect.
This goes back to asking, what I said earlier about how do you know? I think I actually asked this question. He kept saying something about self-awareness, and I'm just so consumed in this interview that I'm pretty sure I asked that too. But it's how do you get to a point where you believe in yourself full-heartedly, like you are just so confident in yourself? And the beta program that I am developing right now with a small handful of students, one of my pillars is presence, your online presence, there's a health fitness part of it. There's a mental health part of it where I'll be helping people with their mental health, along with being a creator and putting yourself out there, but to really get confident with yourself and be you. So for example, I think this guy is a great interviewer, but I, as a person who asks the questions, I'm trying to, he's just really good to watch. There's a handful of people who I already take little tidbits from, but there is a small part of my brain that when I watch these, I'm like, ooh, he did that really well. I'll take that. I haven't seen any from this specific interview. Doesn't mean he's bad. Like I said, he's awesome, but I want to be able to bring that out of people where it's like, when I was in Los Angeles, I saw a lot of people try to vlog like Logan Paul or Casey Neistat, but if they would just take little bits from it and then interject their own personality, then that's where the magic happens. And that's what I want to teach people to do, is to learn to be you and then just turn it up like no other. And I can't wait for that. All right, that does it for this podcast interview breakdown. But before you go, if this is your first time on this channel, my goal is to help podcasters like yourself become the authority in their niche with podcast interviews. So if you have a podcast or you're thinking about starting one shortly, this free download is for you. It's a list of my top 25 podcast interview questions that I use to make me sound like a professional, and it gives me the ability to get those golden nugget sound bites so you can double your downloads and turn your listeners into leads. The link for this is in the description, and we'll see you next time.